Hey, hi everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. So we are probably entering towards the last leg of important individual components in system design. APIs is one such component, that can help you, structure the system design interviews, and that's why there's a dedicated video for this. Uh, because there are a lot of I think nuances while you are designing APIs that you need to answer while you have your system design interview round. So uh, I think we'll definitely try to cover some of the other topics as well. That will give you a good understanding of the concepts, uh, but maybe not as detailed as like we have done for caches and load balancers and message queues. But do let me know if there are certain topics that need as detailed description as for these four or five different topics that we just covered in the previous video. So starting off, I think with APIs, I mean, APIs, more fancy way of functions is how I would like to call it. People familiar with C, C++, I think would know what functions are. APIs are like application programming interface, usually used by two programs or application for communication. There's a request and response model that you can see. Requests are generated primarily by like your web applications, mobile applications, and then APIs are used to interact with your backend servers. Again, an application, right? The backend servers will have, let's say, on the server side, you could have server communication protocols, right? And APIs will definitely like interact through that, and then you have your response back on the application, that generated the request, right? So, typical example for like if you want to just understand the concept, it's when you're actually, let's say, using a web app, right, or a mobile app, you're always given this prompt of logging through one of your social media profiles, right? Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn, whatever, right? Or in some cases, Google as well, right? You can either you can basically have two scenarios. Either you are a user that is already using that app, or you are a new user, right? If you are already a user that is kind of logged in, right, what you're just doing is that you're just passing your user information to that app. If you're a new user, then you're basically doing two things. One is that you link your to the app that you have to tell for the first time that these are my like credentials, right? And then among like the various options that you get, you also tell through the the API that is going to run, that which one do you prefer actually, and that is how you're going to interact with the web application, right? So pretty straightforward example, like you could relate to that. Coming, I think, on to the parts related to the API architectures or the different type of API architectures. This is more, I think, when I cover, I think the types of caches, for example, or type of message queues. I think the idea is to understand the trade-offs when you're bringing in. So in this case, for example, REST APIs, right, representative state transfer APIs, do offer good amount of advantages. Their statelessness is probably number one reason why they are preferred over this simple object access protocol. uh, Also, there is support like large number of formats like HTML, JSON, and XML, whereas SOAP is just supporting XML. uh, there is caching support, which means that REST calls can be stored in like caches, and there's no support for SOAP as far as storing the procedure calls calls are considered on the caches, right? And then I think on your REST side, like you have your guest, post, put and delete. I would say, let's say, sub functions that are related to retrieve, create, and updates and deletion of objects, right? So uh, I think we'll definitely cover if there is interest in, I think, how do you actually design, but I mean, how do you actually use these with a proper example? But just understand, I think, that when you are designing, let's say, a web application, you decide to put in a way to probably talk about API. You should definitely cover what is it that your API would actually help you, whether it's retrieving records, or it is retrieving and updating records at the same time, or it is creating records for the first time, or is it actually related to deletion of records, right? So those, I think, with the details is what you should actually mention while you're discussing APIs. uh, as usual, I definitely like to cover one example in this, and for APIs, fintech, for example, UPI payments, I think, are a pretty good example. There's a lot of integration of UPIs that is available on pretty much any shopping application, right? So if you look at, let's say, a typical shopping app that has a lot of catalog on which the customers are doing a lot of selection, and then they fill out their customer details, and then they're ready to make the payment, right? So the payment on obviously is done through, because UPI payment is allowing for that interface. Now, I want to highlight, I think, one thing here, which is the request and the response model. And this is taken straight away from the Google documentation. It's a public information. Uh, the request and the response is what we had discussed, right, on how I think the interaction actually starts. So if you look at it, it's nothing but, a function that is specifying a lot of parameters, right? And what are these parameters? I think you can look at here. It needs the merchant name on which the payment will be made, right? It needs the merchant BPA, which is the virtual private address. It needs obviously the URL, the transaction reference IDs, right? All the static values related to GST, CGST, invoice numbers and dates, right? So this is basically a request. And where is this request actually originating? So you have to understand, when you're actually filling out the customer details, there would be, like, a call to action, for example, make the payment. When you're doing make the payment, that is when that request is actually being generated. Now you would have linked your, obviously, let's say, UPI app, right, to your bank or whatever it is, right? I'm not getting into those details, but the request is actually when you do the click on make the payment, and you get to that UPI, like, let's say, app, whether phone pay or Google Pay or whatever. In this case, it is Google Pay, so it's pretty straightforward. You would have selected Google Pay, and this is the request that is being generated from the app, right? The other part to that is the response part, right? So I also wanted to, like, highlight that. What is it that you will get in the response? Quite a bit of information that is required to complete the payment back, right, for the merchant, right? You have to close the loop, right, on that merchant payment. So, what typically happens is, once you have generated the request and you have provided, I think, with your details, there will be in between steps where, for example, there will be security layers wherein, like, you're adding a pin, to the transaction, right? Your UPI pin, and then there will be parts wherein that request is also going, let's say, to the bank, right? Because that is where your account is linked, right? So I think this is not covering that in detail, but understand that a typical request will have, like, three or four layers to it. It's not just coming directly to the from the make the payment button. It does not take generate a response directly, right? It goes to the bank, gets, I think, the payment details, for example, whatever else, like, the amount, right? So I think transaction info, if you look at it, right, I mean, I think, what is the price, currency, whatever, right? That needs to be made, right? And then the response would be basically, is what you actually get from your UPI app, right? So you get the transaction details, right? You have a expiration token, I think, on the message. The payment method, obviously, because we selected UPI, it's kind of highlighted here. All the details related to the merchant, right? The payment merchant detail, right? So the pay, for example, you look at the merchant a VPA, that's the same, right? The status is, and the obviously the most important part around the pricing, right, of the product, right? So all of that is pushed back as a response onto your app, and then that is put onto the merchant, right? The merchant makes the confirmation that the payment has been received, that is blah blah blah. I think that is not covered here, but I think you get the idea on how this flow actually on the shopping cart, right from your selection to selecting the payment, is actually handled through APIs, uh, right? I'll also quickly cover one more use case, which is again from Google's extensive document, and this time it is related to card payments instead of the UPI payment. So what happens, I think, in that is instead of I think your UPI calls, I think you are just allowing your Visa or Mastercard details to be passed in a request, and of course like everything else remains the same, which is the pricing information, invoices and IDs related to that. And then on the response side, you obviously get the response. It could be an encrypted response because there are card details on it. You might just get, I think, a success or a failure response, right, in form of encrypted token, and that's about it, right? So typically, I think when it comes to system design, if you are able to explain this kind of a flow with these level of details, I think you should score pretty high, on the API design part. Also, I think do definitely, as I mentioned, right, do stress out on the fact that uh, what are the formats that your API is looking at, right? I mean, typically, I think all of this, for example, you see, is will be in JSON, right? But might be cases, for example, where you might have to just structure your APIs in HTML format, right? Um, I think HTML format might be more useful when you're just developing web applications. So, depending on your application, I think you can, but JSON probably for 90% of I think API structures I think would work. So I hope this video was useful. Uh, I think next what I plan to cover is some of the live system design interview questions. And system design interview questions are like very open ended. Like for example, you will be just given a straightforward statement like design a feed system for me, or design a rate limiter, or design URL shortener, right? And whatever we have covered so far, I think should give you good structure. The only part I think which I think would be useful would be data models, but I want to cover I think a live like use case so that we can actually get into the details of developing a data model, as opposed to spending time and understanding what is a SQL database, no SQL database, properties, related to databases. Not like I would not say those are not useful, but we'll jump directly, I think, into designing the system, and then probably take a break and come back again to maybe designing, discussing these concepts. But feel free to leave comments, and if you feel, I think, it is useful, to cover, I think, some topics, any type of architectures or uh, differences in, let's say, certain type of database type, right? Or preferences also for if you want me to cover a particular type of system design, I think please feel free to leave a comment. So I hope this video was useful, and until next time, take care.